Okay, so imagine this, you're a street samurai in a world where like magic is code and you've got this katana that's like glowing with digital fire and you're facing down a cybernetically enhanced dragon. Pretty wild, right?
Oh, yeah, it gets wild. Last week, we were playing D&D, and our party had to infiltrate like this corporate skyscraper, and it was guarded by the security AI that could predict like every single move we made.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we barely made it out with the data, thanks to our decker who was thinking super fast, and also some really well-placed spells.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's what I love about the idea of cyberpunk D&D. Like, it's this amazing blend of fantasy and sci-fi. It just opens up so many possibilities. You actually sent us an article that explores this. It dives into exactly that.
It's a piece from LitRPG Reads. It was published January 16th, 2025 by Hunterson. It's called D&D Cyberpunk Worldbuilding: How to Craft the Perfect Futuristic Campaign Setting. And it really gets into like all the details of how to build a cyberpunk world for your D&D games.
So, let's start with the basics. What makes cyberpunk so unique as a genre, and why is it such a good fit for D&D?
Well, cyberpunk is all about these dystopian societies where technology has advanced so much that it's almost like magic.
Right.
But this technology often comes at a price. You have these massive corporations that control everything. There's a huge gap between the rich and the poor, and there's this feeling that society's about to collapse.
So it kind of sounds like a classic D&D setting in a way.
Yeah.
You know, you have these powerful forces that are controlling the world, and it's up to the players to fight for like freedom and justice. But instead of fighting like a tyrannical king or an evil sorcerer, you're facing down like corporate overlords and rogue AIs.
That's exactly it. The article gives some great examples of how this could play out in like a D&D game.
Right.
Like imagine a mega corporation that's controlling an entire city-state. And it uses all this advanced surveillance technology and propaganda to keep the people in line. Or you could have a world where augmented reality is shaping like public perception to the point where people can't tell what's real and what's manufactured.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to get a real feel for this. The article also talks about how to design specific locations for a cyberpunk D&D game.
Yes.
Right.
And it's not your typical dungeons and taverns. It's more like dimly lit hacker dens that are hidden beneath the city streets. Bustling black markets where you can find illegal cybernetic enhancements. And then those massive corporate headquarters that just loom over everything.
Yeah, I could already picture my party like sneaking through the ventilation shafts of a corporate skyscraper trying to hack into their mainframe to expose some evil scheme. But what about the tech itself? How does the article recommend incorporating technology into D&D?
Well, it emphasizes that technology can be a blessing and a curse for the players. So, for example, you could have characters that have cybernetic implants that give them these incredible abilities. But those implants could malfunction or be hacked.
Oh.
Or they might find powerful hacking devices, but then attract the attention of a rogue AI.
That brings like a really interesting point. The article talks about this idea of technomancy, where magic and technology are kind of intertwined.
Yes.
What are some examples of how that could work in a D&D setting?
So imagine a wizard who can manipulate data streams like their spells, or a cleric that uses nanites to heal people.
Wow.
Or how about a dragon whose scales are actually solar panels that are powering this devastating energy breath weapon? I mean, the possibilities are pretty crazy.
That's awesome. I'm already brainstorming character ideas. But with all this advanced technology, wouldn't it be easy for players to become, like, overpowered?
That's a good point. The article stresses the importance of balance.
Yeah?
Technology comes with risks and drawbacks. So, for example, relying too heavily on cybernetic enhancements could make you vulnerable to things like EMP blasts or hackers.
So it's all about weighing the risks and rewards, making those tough choices that define a good cyberpunk story. And speaking of story, what about the NPCs that players would encounter in this world?
Oh, forget your typical, like, tavern keepers and blacksmiths. Think about street-smart hackers that can get you anything for the right price.
Yeah.
Ambitious corporate executives who will do anything to climb the ladder. Or even, like, rogue androids that are struggling with their identity.
Yeah, that reminds me of that replicant in, well, I won't spoil it for our listeners.
Right.
But the idea of playing a D&D game where you could encounter an AI that's, like, questioning its own existence is just fascinating.
It opens up all these possibilities for role-playing and exploring those complex philosophical questions that cyberpunk is known for. The article even has like a whole list of potential NPCs, and they each have their own motivations and secrets.
Okay, so we've got the setting, the tech, the NPCs. What about the adventures themselves?
Yeah.
How does the article recommend designing quests that fit this cyberpunk theme?
It suggests leaning into those classic cyberpunk tropes like corporate espionage, AI uprisings, and those morally gray areas where the line between good and bad gets kind of blurry.
So instead of your typical, like, clear the dungeon and slay the dragon quests, we're talking about infiltrating corporate servers, negotiating with shady black market figures, or maybe even making choices that have some serious consequences for the city.
Exactly. The article gives this example of a digital heist adventure where the players have to use their skills and tech to steal valuable data from like a heavily fortified server. It's kind of like a classic dungeon crawl, but instead of navigating traps and monsters, you're dealing with firewalls, encryption algorithms, and maybe even a rogue security AI.
I can see how that would be a blast to play. It's like taking the strategy and problem solving of a traditional D&D dungeon and applying it to a digital landscape.
And there's just so much room for role-playing, too. Like, imagine the tension as your decker is trying to crack that final firewall while the rest of the party is fending off virtual security programs or dealing with a physical security team that's been alerted to their presence.
You've got me hooked. What other kinds of adventures does the article suggest?
It mentions a scenario where a really powerful AI goes rogue and it takes control of like the city's infrastructure and is threatening to just unleash chaos. The players have to decide if they want to try to reason with the AI or find a way to shut it down, or maybe even side with it if they think its motives are justified.
Wow. That sounds like it could lead to some really intense moral dilemmas. And it really taps into that core cyberpunk theme of questioning like the nature of technology and its impact on society.
Right. It's not always clear who the good guys are in a cyberpunk world. Corporations might be exploiting people, but they also provide jobs and stability. AIs might be capable of doing good, but they can also become dangerous if they malfunction or fall into the wrong hands.
It's like the article says cyberpunk is all about those gray areas where the lines are blurred, and that just makes for a much more compelling and thought-provoking game. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about how to actually bring this cyberpunk world to life at the game table. Does the article offer any advice on creating that immersive cyberpunk atmosphere?
Oh, absolutely. It talks about using all sorts of cyberpunk aesthetics in the game, like incorporating neon colors, rain-soaked streets, synthwave music, and even digital graffiti as like a symbol of rebellion.
I love that. I can just imagine the scene. The players are huddled in this dimly lit hacker den. The rain's pouring outside. The only light is coming from the glow of their computer screens as they're planning their next move.
Exactly. And don't forget the music. A good synthwave soundtrack can really set the mood and transport players to that gritty, neon-drenched world.
It sounds like there are so many ways to make a cyberpunk D&D game a truly immersive experience. But with all these possibilities, how does the article recommend keeping things balanced and manageable for both players and the dungeon master?
Well, it stresses the importance of focusing on those core themes of cyberpunk and giving players the freedom to create characters that really fit that setting. Whether they want to play a streetwise hacker, a cybernetically enhanced soldier, or a tech-savvy mage, it's all about finding ways to make those concepts work within the rules of D&D.
So it's not about throwing in every single cyberpunk trope or gadget, but rather about creating a cohesive world that feels both familiar and fresh. And what about the dungeon master? What advice does the article have for running a cyberpunk campaign?
It really emphasizes the importance of collaboration and improvisation. The DM should work with the players to create a world that feels responsive to their actions and choices. It's about creating a story together, not just following a pre-written script.
That makes a lot of sense. In a cyberpunk world, things can change really quickly, and players might make choices that have unexpected consequences. The DM needs to be ready to roll with those punches and keep the story moving in an exciting direction.
Exactly. And the article also encourages DMs to embrace moral ambiguity in their games. Don't be afraid to present players with difficult choices that don't have easy answers. Let them wrestle with those ethical dilemmas and see how their choices shape the world around them.
That's what makes cyberpunk so compelling, right? It's a genre that forces us to confront those tough questions about technology, society, and what it means to be human in a world that's increasingly dominated by machines.
Absolutely. And by playing out those scenarios in a D&D game, we can explore those themes in a safe and engaging way. We can experiment with different choices and see how they play out, maybe even gain some insights into our own relationship with technology in the real world.
That's a really interesting point. It's like using D&D as a kind of thought experiment to explore the possibilities and challenges of the future. Speaking of which, I remember the article mentioning that cyberpunk often has a sense of hope, even amidst the dystopia. Did it touch on how to incorporate that into a game?
It did. And it's a crucial element, I think. The article suggests giving players opportunities to fight back against the oppressive forces in the world to make a difference, even if it's just on a small scale.
So it's not just about surviving in a bleak and hopeless world. It's about finding ways to push back against the darkness and maybe even create a better future.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly empowering for players. It gives them a sense of agency and purpose in a world that can often feel overwhelming. It reminds them that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
I love that message. It's something we all need to hear, especially in today's world. But before we get too philosophical, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about those digital heists. Do you think players would need any special skills or abilities to pull off a heist in cyberspace?
That's a great question, and the article actually addresses that directly. It suggests adapting existing D&D classes to fit the cyberpunk setting. For example, a rogue could become a skilled hacker using their stealth and expertise to infiltrate computer systems. A wizard could specialize in manipulating data streams or crafting digital illusions.
So you're not necessarily creating brand new classes, but rather reimagining existing ones to fit the cyberpunk theme. What a clever way to make the transition to this new setting feel more seamless.
Right, and allows players to use their favorite classes in a fresh and exciting way. It also opens up some really interesting possibilities for multi-classing. Imagine a fighter hacker who's equally adept at wielding a katana and navigating virtual reality.
That's such a cool idea. And it really gets to the heart of what makes Cyberpunk D&D so appealing. It's this fusion of fantasy and sci-fi that creates something truly unique. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I wanted to touch on something you said earlier about the ethical dilemmas that often arise in cyberpunk stories. Do you think players are ready to grapple with those kinds of complex issues in a game?
I think so. And I think the article does a great job of highlighting how to present those dilemmas in a way that's both engaging and thought-provoking. It's not about preaching or lecturing players, but rather about giving them the opportunity to make meaningful choices and explore the consequences of those choices.
So it's about creating a space where players can safely experiment with different moral approaches and see how those choices play out in a fictional world.
Exactly. And who knows? Maybe by wrestling with those ethical dilemmas in a game, players might gain some insights that they can apply to their own lives and the challenges we face as a society.
That's a really powerful idea. It suggests that D&D can be more than just a game. It can be a tool for exploring complex issues and developing our moral compass.
I completely agree. And I think cyberpunk, with its focus on technology, society, and the human condition, is the perfect genre for those kinds of explorations.
Well, I have to say, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of how to create a compelling and thought-provoking cyberpunk D&D campaign.
Me too. And I'm sure our listener who sent us this article is going to have a blast putting these ideas into practice.
Speaking of our listener, we want to give a big shout out to them for introducing us to this fascinating topic. And a special nod to LitRPG Reads and author Rich Hunterson for providing such a valuable resource for gamers and world builders. You know, as we've been talking about all these cyberpunk D&D ideas, I've been thinking about how this genre really, taps into something that's relevant to our lives today.
Oh, yeah, totally. Cyberpunk is really all about the relationship between humanity and technology and how technology can both empower us and exploit us.
Yeah.
It's a reflection of the anxieties and possibilities that we're seeing unfold in the real world.
It's like that fine line the article talks about, the promise and peril that come with technological progress.
Right.
We're surrounded by all these incredible advancements in AI, biotechnology, virtual reality, but we're also facing all these issues like data privacy surveillance and the potential for these technologies to be used for really harmful purposes. Cyberpunk explores those anxieties and those possibilities in a really visceral way, and I think that's why it resonates with so many people.
Yeah, definitely. And it goes beyond just the technology itself. Cyberpunk also delves into social and economic disparities, the concentration of power in the hands of megacorporations, and the struggle for individual freedom in a world that feels increasingly controlled. I mean, these are all themes that are very relevant to our current social and political landscape.
It's so fascinating how a genre that originated in the 1980s can still feel so prophetic and relevant today. It's almost like those early cyberpunk authors had a glimpse into the future and were trying to warn us about the potential pitfalls of unchecked technological advancement.
I think there's some truth to that. But cyberpunk also offers this sense of hope.
Yeah.
A belief that even in the face of overwhelming odds, individuals can still make a difference. It's about those hackers, rebels, and outcasts who fight against the system, trying to carve out a space for themselves in a world that's increasingly dominated by corporations and technology.
That's what I love about those classic cyberpunk heroes. They're not superheroes with superpowers. They're ordinary people who use their wit, their skills, and their courage to challenge the status quo. They inspire us to believe that we can make a difference, even when things seem really bleak.
They remind us that even in a dystopian future, the human spirit can endure and even thrive. And that's a message that's always relevant no matter what year it is.
Well said.
Yeah.
So to wrap up our deep dive into Cyberpunk D&D, what are some key takeaways that you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Okay, well, first remember that Cyberpunk D&D isn't just about creating a cool setting with flashy tech and neon lights.
Thank you.
It's about exploring those deeper themes, those questions about humanity, technology, and the choices we make. It's about creating a world that feels both familiar and unsettling, a world that reflects our anxieties about the future, but also our hope for something better.
And second, don't be afraid to get creative. Cyberpunk is a genre that thrives on innovation and pushing boundaries. Experiment with different character concepts, adventure ideas, and world-building elements. Draw inspiration from real-world technology, social trends, and even your own fears and aspirations.
Exactly. The beauty of D&D is that it allows you to create your own unique worlds and tell your own stories. And with Cyberpunk, the possibilities are truly endless.
And who knows, maybe by playing out these cyberpunk scenarios in a game, we can gain some insights that will help us navigate the challenges of our own technological landscape. We might even find inspiration to create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
That's a great point. After all, as they say, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And what better way to create it than by rolling some dice, letting our imaginations run wild, and exploring those uncharted territories where fantasy and technology collide.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
So to our listener who sent us this fantastic article, thank you again for inspiring this deep dive. We want to give another shout out to LitRPG Reads and a special nod to Paul Bello for their work in bringing this amazing genre to life.
We hope this episode has given you some inspiration for your own cyberpunk D&D adventures.
And to all our listeners out there, we have one final thought-provoking question for you. If you were to design a cyberpunk D&D character, what unique blend of skills, tech, and maybe even magic would you choose to survive and thrive in this world of high-tech and low-life? Share your answers in the comments below. We'd love to hear your ideas.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep rolling those critical hits.